Is the media trying to mitigate the disaster that is Disney's Snow White? Let's talk about it. Welcome to the Box Office Revival. I'm Brandon Gray, creator of Box Office Mojo, coming at you with this story from Deadline. Snow White, poisoned by controversy at box office, won't have a happy ending with $115 million loss. What went wrong? Ooh, all right, let's dive in. Writes Deadline. Disney's Rachel Zegler and Gal Gadot starring Snow White is headed to an estimated loss of $115 million after all global home entertainment, TV, and Disney Plus ancillaries, according to distribution sources Monday. Anonymous ones, it seems. The loss, which was expected, is based on final worldwide box office of $225 million. So what's curious about this statement is that what was expected? Well, when was this expected? I mean, was this expected when they decided to make this movie? Obviously not, but at what point in time was it expected that Snow White would lose over $100 million? If that's all it's losing. Again, as we go, you'll see some of this is based on speculation, including the final worldwide tally of $225 million. The story confesses that Snow White may not even get to $100 million domestically. That means it needs to do another $125 million internationally to achieve $225 million in total. This may not happen. It still could happen, but it hasn't happened yet. As it stands, Snow White is still in the $140 million range globally. And of course, its best days are behind it. So, moving on. In this second paragraph, they break the box office down like I just did. But they fail to mention that Snow White did have the steepest drop ever for a Disney live-action remake. It was down 63%, actually, topping Dumbo's 58% drop-off, among others. But they only mentioned Dumbo and Maleficent here, not emphasizing the fact that this is the steepest one yet for a Disney live-action remake. Now, here's where Deadline breaks down how they come up with that $115 million estimated or projected loss, detailing what the revenue sources are and what the expenses were. So let me sum that up for you. So on the left side, we have expenses, and on the right side, we have revenues. And these numbers are in terms of millions of dollars. So starting with expenses and the production cost, we have it at $270 million. And Deadline is quoting this as the net production price tag, which assumes that they're taking out all the tax write-offs, deductions, and whatnot to get to this final net price tag. For global marketing, they're saying $111 million. And then for residuals and miscellaneous stuff, another $29 million for a grand total of $410 million. That's the big hurdle that Snow White has to cross just to break even. Well, even by what some may say are Deadline's own generous projections, it's not going to do that. So heading to revenues here, we have the rentals. This is the amount of money that goes back to the studio from the box office. So if it makes $225 million, that means Disney is taking back $101 million, and the exhibitors are getting back about $124 million. And this stands to reason somewhat because Snow White's international box office is higher than its domestic box office, and studios get a smaller cut of the international box office, whereas in America, they're typically getting over 50% of the box office. So that's probably where they're coming up with this 101 figure. But again, it is predicated on Snow White grossing $225 million worldwide. Now, the next figure is home entertainment. So this $62 million includes PVOD, physical media purchases, etc. So they're estimating about $62 million made from that. and that's probably minus the cut from the distributors, like Prime or Apple or whatnot. Yeah, so that might be a generous number. It's hard to imagine people renting Snow White, paying for it. It's hard to imagine many people actually buying the 4K Blu-ray set of this, but hey, there can be some wild people out there. Yikes. Streaming and TV licensing, $130 million. You see, that is the bulk of the revenue that they're projecting. Now, this is quite elaborate. We don't have all the details. Deadline even admits that this is a complicated figure. They do also admit that it's most of it or much of it is Disney paying itself to put Snow White on Disney Plus. That's right. From one hand of the company to the other hand of the company. They're not making money here, yet they're counting it as money being made by Snow White. And perhaps they're giving Snow White an elevated rate to be licensed to Disney Plus. I mean, that's how a lot of these movies can, I guess, show that they're breaking even or show that they're making money. That's one of the methods they use. So, in case you don't know, Disney movies, for the most part, exclusively go to Disney Plus. Disney doesn't license their movies out like, say, Sony or a Universal. So they are not getting that juicy streaming revenue that some of these studios get. And it's hard to imagine that they're making up for it in ad revenue. Anyway, actually, you know what? Look at this. Is actually a funnier number. Merchandising, just $2 million. Remember that old quote from Spaceballs? Merchandising, it's where the real money from the movie is made. Well, not in the case of Snow White, apparently. Deadline is only projecting about $2 million worth of merchandising revenue for a grand total of $295 million. And so, of course, 410 minus 295, that gets you to the $115 million loss. And by the way, back to the story here, Deadline gives an excuse for the $270 million cost of the picture. They say, thanks to starts and stops due to the strikes and a fire on the UK set. So there were no major reshoots for Snow White that had nothing to do with the strikes? I don't know. We all thought there were, but I guess they're not counting that here. Anyway, moving on to the next part of the story, and this is where some wishful thinking may be coming into play. Keep in mind that the above doesn't indicate future... Wait a second. Hey, they need a copy editor here. Anyway, keep in mind that the above doesn't indicate future monies from theme parks or cruise ancillaries down the road. Also, realize that once Snow White hits Disney Plus, it could take on a viewership life of its own and have a second halo that's unforeseen at this point. Really? Come on, man. Hey, stranger things have happened, I suppose, but the likelihood of that for Snow White, this Snow White? These live-action remakes tend to not have that second life. It's actually... they bring life to the originals more so than anything. So maybe 1937 Snow White will get a bump, but this one? Unlikely. But now here's where Deadline really reaches. They say, in a battered box office where brand is king, Snow White wasn't a dumb decision for Disney. It was logical. Wait, let me pause here. May not have been a dumb decision, but it certainly was a dopey decision, and I would contend not a logical decision, simply because Beauty and the Beast did well or Aladdin did well does not mean Snow White will do well. That is not a logical conclusion from that. The best you're going to get is perhaps Cinderella from 2015, which did over $200 million domestically, well over $500 million worldwide in 2015. Because Snow White is an adaptation of a classic Disney princess, but I would argue an even less relatable princess than Cinderella. Remember, Snow White 1937, as amazing as it was Disney's first live-action feature. In part, it was a demonstration that this could be done. And it was wildly successful. Certainly the most popular animated feature in theaters of all time. But that doesn't mean people love it to this day. I would say if Disney was honest with itself, they would realize that people respect Snow White 1937 more than they love it. People probably love Cinderella more. It came out, 13 years later, 1950. Disney was more advanced then. It had a more relatable story, a story that has been successful outside of Disney. So many movies are basically remakes of Cinderella that do well. Snow White, not so much. Snow White has a very spotty track record being remade. For every Snow White and the Huntsman, there's a mirror mirror. So this was by no means a smart or logical decision on Disney's part to spend over $200 million on a live action remake of Snow White. But instead of getting to the heart of the matter, and there's plenty of reasons why not to do Snow White, I'm just touching upon some of them here. But from Deadline's perspective, they're talking about the talent. They say, 500 Days of Summer, Mark Webb directing. He also directed The Amazing Spider-Man and The Amazing Spider-Man 2, by the way. Wicked's Mark Platt producing. Yes, Mark Platt, an amazingly successful producer, but he's produced a lot of these Disney live-action remakes, including The Little Mermaid, which was a box office disappointment. And, of course, they mentioned Oscar winners Pasek and Paul writing songs. Well, it doesn't matter unless the songs are good. I mean, these are the gentlemen who did the Greatest Showman, La La Land, a number of famous recent musicals. But if the songs aren't cooking in the new Snow White, it doesn't matter who wrote them, right? The bottom line is that none of these folks put butts in seats on their names alone. I mean, what they're bringing is their experience at crafting a movie. That's great and all, but you're missing the point. You could have the best auteurs, the best artists, the best craftsmen, and if it's in service of a story that nobody's interested in, the movie's still going to bomb. Let's get back to that aspect. Deadline. Story continues. Still, what does everyone learn from this exercise? Okay, are you going to bring it to me now? Are you going to really talk about the fundamentals of what sells a picture? All right, here we go. Clearly, the age-old adage that controversy is bad for a movie's publicity still holds. Disney went through this before in swapping Lord and Miller as directors for Ron Howard on Solo, a Star Wars story. That movie's box office fate was sealed from there, and it became one of the lowest grossing Star Wars movies ever at $393 million worldwide. Okay, you're still missing the point, Deadline, and nobody in the real world, in the movie ticket buying public, cared that Lord and Miller were switched out for Ron Howard. Why, you're using the example of Solo, a Star Wars story here. Are you serious? That's another movie that was flawed fundamentally, a movie that should never have been made, especially after what they did to Han Solo in The Force Awakens. Nobody cares about the backstory of this loser at that point, and you're going backwards. This is not a focused story. It's like, let's find out how Solo became Solo. I mean, who the hell cares? There's no way in hell that movie was ever going to be a major blockbuster. Even those who say The Last Jedi killed it. Well, The Last Jedi did not help coming out 6 months before this. Certainly not. But I'm just saying, at the essence, Solo, a Star Wars story, was kind of doomed, whether it was Ron Howard directing or whether it was Lord and Miller. I guess if they at least went with Lord and Miller, it might have been a more interesting movie. Could have become a cult Star Wars thing. But hey, no, they didn't. They went the bland way, and you see what happened. Anyway, furthermore, Zegler's comments on Snow White didn't help, and neither did her engagement with trolls ranting about a Latina in the title role. Well, that's not all the trolls ranted about. To be fair, they also were upset at her disparaging the original Snow White at Disney's own events. So that's a big part of it. Oh, here's this. This is getting really rich. But we can't deny Zegler's sublime talent, and she shouldn't be punished. This happens with young stars who are unabashed about sharing their opinions, having been raised in a social media world. Well, yeah, that latter part is probably true. Kids these days, But the fact that they're saying she shouldn't be punished, well, it's not about punishment. It's just about consequences. You starred in a movie that flopped. So at the very least, your quote should go down, right? Maybe you're not cast in as many movies as as you were before. I mean, that is kind of the way it should work, right? You've been rejected by the market. So you might call that punishment, but I call it reality. Deadline now offers a fix. Let's see. Disney could have screened the movie early for social media influencers to get great word of mouth out there. Well, actually, they sort of did that with the premiere a week earlier. They had a very select few see the picture to try to get the great word of mouth out there. And, well, what they got was tepid word of mouth out there. So if you screened it sooner, you just would have more time of tepid word of mouth leading up to the release of your picture. Kind of like what Disney did with Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, debuting that at Cannes 1 month before the movie came out. So you had 1 month of bad to tepid reviews before the movie even debuted. At least with Snow White, it was only 1 week. So yes, the deadline is assuming that Snow White would have received great word of mouth from social media influencers. I guess if you paid them off, it might, but just in general, no. But here, now they get to something that's of substance. Still, as we reported, the uphill with Snow White is the fact it's a feature take of a classic Disney tune, like Dumbo, Maleficent, and those have a very different box office outcome than anything being adapted past the Disney Renaissance. I'm going to paraphrase that. The Disney Renaissance, starting with Little Mermaid. But here, they say something, again, ignoring the history of what actually happened. Alice in Wonderland is the exception, with a $1 billion global take made with the acid stylings of Tim Burton and Johnny Depp, when the latter was hot as hell in a pre-streaming 2010. Well, they ignore one fact about Alice in Wonderland, is that it was the next big 3D event in the wake of Avatar. So there was a fad thing going on with Alice in Wonderland. And of course, it was also a very different spin on the subject matter with Tim Burton and Johnny Depp. Yes, that part is correct, but you're also missing some of the historical context here. Alice in Wonderland could not even replicate its appeal with its sequel that came out later. Alice Through the Looking Glass was a huge flop for Disney. Anyway, I do appreciate Deadline trying to correct the record in this era of exaggerated, tabloidy, clickbaity headlines. We will likely never know precisely how much money Snow White lost. So much of this is behind the scenes, very secretive and whatnot. Suffice it to say, Snow White is a huge money loser and a historic failure. Remember, the original Snow White is the movie that made Disney. And now this new Snow White, it's the movie that further tarnishes the reputation. I would say it's the movie that ruins Disney, but there are many other movies that have come out recently that have been doing a fine job ruining the brand as well. Snow White is reflecting the previous mistakes of Disney. This is not just about the Snow White movie itself, it's also about the brand of Disney. But Disney does hope to recover with Lilo and Stitch opening Memorial Day weekend. This is a case where they're adapting a movie people love. Not just respect, but love. So, worst case scenario, Lilo and Stitch, even if it doesn't do $1 billion, it's still going to do a hell of a lot more than $2 million worth of merchandising like this new Snow White picture. Anyway, what say you? Do you think the trades are running cover for Disney here? Do you think the picture is going to lose more than $115 million? I mean, do you trust these numbers? As I said before, we'll never know for sure, but at least they're admitting a 9-figure loss, right? Bright side. Anyway, if you're looking for the objective perspective on the movies and the box office, well, you came to the right place, friend. Please like this video if you do like it, and please subscribe to the Box Office Revival. Thank you for watching.